Next, the Great Quake of '89, an ABC News special. Peter Jennings in San Francisco with the latest on what has been lost and the ongoing relief effort. Stories of tragedy and heroism. An ABC News special next.
This is an Action News Brief.
Good evening, I'm Kathy Marshall in the Action Newsroom. The makings of a miracle in San Francisco. Reports from the collapsed 880 bridge say rescuers have found someone alive now. We'll have the very latest. I-91 here in Connecticut has just reopened at this hour after a terrible accident involving a bus and several cars. Nearly a dozen rushed to the hospital tonight. We'll have those reports and more coming up at 11 on the Late Edition.
This is an ABC News special.
You can see this building is collapsed. They don't know if people are still in there or if they aren't. You can see the fire down past me. What has happened is that the natural gas lines have ruptured, and that is what has caused that fire.
This is obviously an area that has been very hard hit. Fire crews coming into this inferno as apartment buildings collapsed.
Store water, prepare for aftershocks, prepare for 3 days of no services. You got 90 minutes of light left. You better make use of your time. Instead of here ain't doing nothing.
An unofficial word, or it perhaps is official now, 7 people, we know 7 people have died in this crash, including in this quake rather.
And preliminary reports right now are that there may be as many as 8 to 40 dead. 8 to 40 dead, many others injured. This again is a stretch of the freeway. The upper ramp collapsed onto the lower ramp. And we understand that the columns gave way. Those columns began to crumble and sway, and the freeway collapsed down.
But I do see a fire. I know there is a fire in what would be the Marina District, or very close to it. It's not far from Fisherman's Wharf.
They all came and saw the same thing. 2 slabs of concrete at points compressed to perhaps within 6 inches of each other. Estimates that perhaps 250 people had been killed underneath and 400 injured. If you have anything to do with Public Works, if you're not there by now and you're just waking up, they need you. They really do.
From ABC News, this is continuing coverage of the Great Quake of '89. Now reporting from San Francisco, Peter Jennings.
Good evening from a city that is trying to recover its balance. This region, San Francisco and Oakland, and then farther south in the Silicon Valley and through the Santa Cruz Mountains, people are hurting. Earthquakes don't have names like hurricanes do, but people will not forget this one in a hurry, the one that began in the World Series. The baseball commissioner incidentally said tonight that the World Series will not resume until at least next Tuesday. Very often today, when asking people to look back on those 15 terrible seconds, they tend to say at first they thought it was simply another tremor. But of course, it was a killer. And as the flight numbers of hijacks are so easily remembered, people will not easily forget Highway 880, the Nimitz Freeway in Oakland. Over there on the Oakland side tonight, they actually believe they have found someone alive. They do not know whether it's an adult or a child, but as the rescue teams did all last night and through today, they try to penetrate the tons of steel and concrete in the hope that they'll be successful. It was rush hour, that time of day when people on or under freeways, in their cars, on bridges, were particularly vulnerable. It wasn't supposed to happen on Highway 880, but it did. Here's ABC's Greg Dobbs.
From the first moments after the freeway fell, it was not just a humanitarian rescue, it was a frantic hunt.
With our flashlights, we went under the second deck, crawled in, and looked around, and all we could see was pinned cars. We called out, was anybody alive? No one answered.
Then by early morning, when the most reachable victims had been extracted, the frantic hunt turned meticulous. Firemen climbed gingerly up the side of this flattened freeway, sweeping its surface with their flashlights, looking for signs of life. They found none. And later, trained Dobermans roamed among the ruins to detect survivors. They found none. By midday, Oakland's Mayor Lionel Wilson announced that this phase of the hunt must soon end.
We believe that there are that it's not likely that there are any people alive still on that freeway in any of those vehicles.
But while every sign pointed to the same conclusion, those with the most at stake staked out the site of the search.
I'm here solely to look for my son, to know if he's alive or dead.
Daniel Ruby's son Juan never came home last night. He would have been right about here when the freeway fell. His father is sure he's trapped, but not sure he's dead.
Maybe he could be in a coma or something of a nature like that, where he can't respond or show any body signs, but he could be still alive.
It was evident by this afternoon that public officials disagreed. After hunting for places where this precarious house of cards might give way, they moved in cranes and pneumatic jacks to take the first steps toward tearing it down.
It's not looking good. I mean, we're hoping that there are some spots that there's some survivors, but from what we've seen as it sits right now, we've seen absolute destruction.
Well, ABC's Greg Dobbs has been standing by on 880 all last night and through today. Greg, we mentioned that they think they found a survivor. Do they know anything more than that?
What we know is that they heard some sounds, and so they moved their cranes, they moved their lights, they moved many of their people to the place about a mile north of where they heard the sounds, and they can only hope that those sounds will lead them to somebody who has in fact lived for 24 hours in the rubble since the earthquake.
Okay, Greg Dobbs, thank you very much over on 880. It's worth remembering that in other earthquakes, Romania, Italy, Mexico, people have lived as long as 3 weeks, and tiny children, babies particularly, lived long times because they weren't afraid, not old enough to know that they were afraid. You may remember those tiny infants rescued after so long in Mexico City. Now, we mentioned that the World Series has been put off until next Tuesday. Standing by, giving us a few minutes of his time over in Candlestick Park, is the baseball commissioner and our own reporter for sports and for news, Al Michaels. Commissioner, let me ask you first, do you think this has had a devastating effect on baseball? I find that today people are almost embarrassed to talk about baseball in the wake of all this death.
Well, I think you make a good point. The priority here has got to be the community and the safety and protection of the citizens. We know our place, and our place is to wait very quietly until the community is able to enjoy baseball again, and we believe that will be at some point next week.
So would you just restate what you think will happen? What stadium will you open in?
Well, I believe we'll play here at Candlestick, where Al and I are sitting at the moment. I believe it'll be Tuesday, but we need to be sure from the community and from the police that they're going to be in a position to support baseball next Tuesday. So we are planning for Tuesday, but we are certainly aware that it may be delayed.
Commissioner, obviously one of the questions is in regard to the structural integrity of both stadiums.
Exactly.
First, tell us about Candlestick Park, and then what you know about the Oakland Coliseum as well.
Well, I think the news is good for both of these stadia. I think the Candlestick situation is that we found some areas that we need to do some repairs to. We don't believe the damage is at all serious, and we know we are able to fix it. The question is, how long will it take? We think it'll be 3 days, and there's no serious damage here. At Oakland, there's no damage to speak of at all. So we know we can play baseball in these two ballparks as soon as it's appropriate.
Did you consider at all today the possibility of playing at a neutral site, or will you consider perhaps in the near future that eventuality?
Well, certainly that possibility was discussed. It's not a very attractive possibility, and I think it's functionally been ruled out by me.
All right, back to you, Peter.
Commissioner, thanks very much. And Al, we'll see you later in the broadcast, but as the commissioner points out, baseball has its place, and around San Francisco and the Bay Area today, people are still preoccupied with the devastation this earthquake caused to their friends, to their colleagues, and in many cases to their homes. We'll talk to the Vice President a little later on, who's been out here to look at the damage today. And when we come back, why San Francisco and Oakland were not more damaged than they might have been.
ABC News continuing coverage of the Great Quake of '89. Brought to you by Subaru. Live from San Francisco, ABC News coverage of the Great Quake of '89 continues. Once again, Peter Jennings.
Lest you wonder where we are, we're in the Marina District of San Francisco, not very far from Fisherman's Wharf. And here at the moment, they're continuing to search through one particular building in the hope of finding someone alive, though if there's someone alive in there, it'll be very hard to hear them. They do know of at least a couple of people who perished in this building. And if you happen to watch ABC's World News Tonight earlier this evening, that was a whole building just 2 or 3 hours ago, and they had torn it down. The local police chief says that most people in the neighborhood have been accounted for, so they don't believe seriously that there is anybody there alive. The seismologist had predicted an earthquake of this magnitude for some time, though earthquake predicting is still a very primitive science. In other parts of the world at times, it has been almost heartbreaking to see how ill-prepared people have been. Only in Japan and in California, the people seem to really take earthquakes seriously and prepare for them. ABC's Bill Blakemore has covered earthquakes for us all over the world.
San Francisco was built for this. They were prepared.
But we didn't see any real failures of any of the newest structures, which is what we would have expected for an earthquake of this size.
A few old buildings in San Francisco's Marina area where officials had expected trouble did fall or burn. But the same massive forces, 7 points on the Richter scale, last year demolished whole cities in Soviet Armenia and led to weeks of sad searching in the rubble of countless buildings. In downtown San Francisco yesterday, 7 points on the Richter scale merely loosened some bricks and this upstairs corner on a handful of old buildings, while the towering glass walls of the modern skyscrapers lost not one window pane as they swayed in the shocks, just as they were designed to. And since it is collapsing buildings which do almost all the killing in earthquakes, the death count throughout the Bay Area was very low, with the one horrible exception of the crumbling double-decker Nimitz Freeway in Oakland. Some 200 people crushed in their cars on the lower deck. One of the structures built 3 decades ago, before anti-earthquake concrete construction was well understood.
They tend to be brittle, they tend to have very little seismic resistance, and when they collapse catastrophically, they pancake.
In all the rest of Oakland, California, aside from the fact that most people took today off, things could hardly be more normal. The 3 other isolated trouble spots here are already being studied by engineers. The Marina District.
Well, we expected damage in the marina because it's built on fill that was put in there after the earthquake in 1906.
The fallen Bay Bridge section.
The Bay Bridge was a surprise. We expected the bridge to perform without any damage.
And some of the downtown buildings in Santa Cruz.
The damage tended to be in older brick buildings. Unreinforced brick starts to peel apart and pancake.
Everywhere else, the Bay Area's years of constantly improving anti-earthquake building codes have paid off. Even water and gas lines, for the most part, held. In the years since the dramatic 1906 San Francisco earthquake drew attention to the San Andreas Fault, a series of smaller quakes have brought lessons slowly enough for engineers to absorb.
We keep finding mistakes, we keep finding oversights, we keep finding new things about how buildings perform, and not every earthquake is the same.
And if this earthquake had been 7.5 instead of 7 on the scale, about 5 times more powerful as the Richter scale goes, well, even the best anti-earthquake design can only do so much.
If the quake was much larger, we'd have many more buildings like the Cypress overstructure collapsing, and it would be a major disaster because we wouldn't have been able to respond.
Bay Area engineers will now add the few new lessons of this quake to their already enviable body of anti-earthquake knowledge and building standards to get ready for the next big one, whenever it should come. But the biggest lesson of this quake may not be for people who live in California.
If we had a similar quake in the Northeast, the Southeast, or the Central States where they don't have adequate building codes, we'd have an absolute catastrophic disaster with tens of thousands of buildings coming down.
Engineers here say San Francisco's success so far in learning to live with the Earth's deep forces should be an example. Bill Blakemore, ABC News, San Francisco.
It is stunning when you think of it. The difference between an earthquake at 7 on the Richter scale and 7.5 is 5 times more powerful. How little we seem to know of earthquakes and their innate power. Joining us to help us understand a little better at the National Research Center in Golden, Colorado, Bruce Presgrave, and at Cornell University in New York, the seismologist Thomas O'Rourke. Mr. Presgrave, let me ask you first what's on a lot of people's minds here, aftershock. what do you think we can expect, if anything, and of what magnitude?
Well, so far what we've seen is a fair number of aftershocks, but so far they've all been quite low. The biggest aftershock that we have recorded here was 4.7 on the Richter scale. I would say there's a good possibility that aftershocks may continue for the next few hours or days, sometimes even possibly weeks. But generally, we would expect that as time goes on, the aftershocks will get generally smaller in magnitude and less frequent in occurrence.
So the conventional wisdom that we may have a big aftershock here towards the end of the week is just that, it's just conventional wisdom, is it?
Well, we can't rule out that possibility, but I would say as time goes on, it would get less and less likely.
Dr. O'Rourke at Cornell, there's enormous frustration, as you know, on occasions like this, as to why we aren't able to predict earthquakes better. What's the bottom line?
Well, Peter, I think that, and greetings from Ithaca, I think part of the problem in predicting earthquakes is that the forces that are generated are very difficult to understand. There are a variety of different fault mechanisms, and there are problems in sorting these things out in the various geological circumstances. We're joined here by Professor Brian Isaacs, who's a seismologist at Cornell University, who's participating in this interview with me as an earthquake engineer.
Well, I'm very glad to have him there with you. Professor Isaacs, I didn't know you were there, but perhaps you can tell us, why can't we do a better job of predicting earthquakes?
We simply don't understand enough about the physics of earthquake occurrence to predict the exact time and place. We do, however, have a statistical feeling for how often earthquakes occur in certain places. And in fact,
are we getting better as time goes by?
Yes, in fact, this area was targeted as a high probability area for earthquake occurrence by the U.S. Geological Survey.
Can I come back to you, Mr. Presgrave, because you've been in this part of the country. I agree, machines can monitor this part of the country from everywhere. But just to remind people how widely or broadly this earthquake was felt?
Okay, the information that we have so far was that the earthquake was felt as far to the south as the San Fernando Valley, part of Los Angeles, and as far to the east as the Reno, Tahoe, and adjacent areas of western Nevada.
And the other thing that you hear in San Francisco today, I'll toss this up to all of you, this was not the big one. Dr. Presgrave, this was not the big one in your estimation, and should this part of the world still look forward to the big one?
I would say that is correct. Generally, I think most people referring to the big one are talking about the area north and northeast of Los Angeles on the San Andreas Fault. And that study that Dr. Isaacs referred to gave a 60% probability of a major quake, magnitude 7.5 or bigger, in that area north of Los Angeles in the next 30 years. And I would say that today's or yesterday's earthquake up in the Bay Area would have had no effect at all on those probabilities down in the southern part of the fault.
Dr. Presgrave, Dr. O'Rourke, and Dr. Isaacs, thank you very much for joining us. If I appear to be shouting at you, it's because there's a generator going behind me. And they have indeed found in that building within the last couple of minutes what they anticipated to find. Not one, but two other casualties of this earthquake of '89 in San Francisco. Vice President Quayle's plane has just landed in Washington. We anticipate talking to him. We'll be back in just a minute.
Since the beginning of this century, 6 major killer earthquakes have exceeded the destructive power of last evening's San Francisco quake. The biggest was the Alaska quake of 1964, which registered 8.5 on the Richter scale. The Great Quake of '89, an ABC News special, will continue in a moment. Live from San Francisco, ABC News coverage of the Great Quake of '89 continues. Once again, here's Peter Jennings.
All this talk today about how well the region has done That is to say, how efficient the rescue teams have been, how good the morale of the people have been is one thing. All this talk about the resilience in the Bay Area of San Francisco and Oakland is another. But getting these two cities particularly to run at the peak of efficiency they're accustomed to is quite another. It's an enormous challenge for the city and for the state and for the federal government. You do not put bridges and highways back together again overnight. Here's ABC's Tom Jarrell.
San Francisco. Until last night, this was San Francisco. Until last night. Now it looks like this, and this, and this. How does San Francisco recover? Already there's some discernible progress. Thanks to a professional fire department assisted by volunteers, the fires of last night are out. Although the Pacific Bell telephone system faltered with gridlock,
due to the earthquake in the area you are calling, your call cannot be completed at this time.
Once the overload ended, the phone system was found to be undamaged. Water mains, which snap like matchsticks, will take longer to repair. The hardest blow was to the Bay Area's bridges, roads, and superhighways. The Bay Bridge connecting Oakland and San Francisco normally carries more traffic than the combined total for 8 other toll bridges in the area. Experience has shown repairing such spans over water is slow and expensive. In 1983, the Interstate 95 bridge over Connecticut's Mianus River, for example, took 6 months and $10 million to repair. Experts feel the Bay Bridge will cost about the same, but be fixed sooner.
The Bay Bridge will probably take a few months. They may be able to get the lower roadway open within a month or two.
And one of the key approaches to the Bay Bridge is the 2-tiered Highway 880. When a mile of this highway fell, it entombed motorists traveling on the lower level.
And short of a war, you would never expect to see that kind of devastation on a major facility.
Until the Bay Bridge can be reopened, BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, is its best hope. This subway connects the two cities, tunneling beneath the bay. It escaped the quake undamaged. To make do, extra parking lots will be built in Oakland so cars can be left behind. Work shifts will be staggered to reduce the rush hour, and old tourist ferry boats will be pressed into service. Improvisation, it's the stuff upon which great cities survive and rebuild in times of disaster. Peter?
Thank you, Tom Jarrell. We're back in the Marina District of San Francisco, and there's full-scale activity here now trying to take down another building. The reason they've begun again so aggressively to bring down this building and a number of others which the city authorities deem unsafe is because they indeed have found the 2 bodies they were looking for. And as the firemen go away, the firefighters in San Francisco go away, they confirm that it was a man and it was a woman, and they were in their mid-30s. Until about a month ago, unless you were personally involved in a disaster like this, an earthquake or a hurricane, you may never have heard of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. It's the federal agency which is supposed to coordinate what all federal agencies can do to help in a situation like this. President Bush made a highly publicized visit to FEMA headquarters in Washington this morning, and FEMA has taken a very highly visible position in trying to help in this particular earthquake. FEMA has something of an image problem from the hurricane at Charleston in South Carolina. Here's ABC's Mike Von Friend.
The streets of downtown Charleston look normal now, but in the suburbs it is a different story. 3 weeks after the storm, areas remain overwhelmed with debris. Michelle Klein's 4th child was born a week after Hugo hit. Her family spent 2 weeks in a flooded house without electricity or running water. She says she prays that the people of San Francisco get help sooner than she did.
With the earthquake victims, I hope they get out there quicker, because it's not fair. It's not fair. If it shouldn't be like that, then get out there quick and help those people. You just can't leave people homeless with kids and diapers.
In the aftermath of Hugo, Charleston became a city of lines. Residents had to wait for everything. And the mayor said again today that the federal government, and particularly FEMA, should have moved faster.
What there is needed is kind of a SWAT team. What we didn't have, and what would have been so helpful, is kind of for FEMA to come in proactive.
The FEMA command center here now has a staff of 450. The agency has already given grants to residents totaling more than $4 million. The man who is running this operation says the agency has learned from Hugo, but insists the criticism is unfounded.
Not one call, not one single call occurred during those first few days of where is FEMA's recovery assistance, because people were dealing with real live crisis emergency situations. Those should be dealt with on the front end. Then we will deal with recovery.
But many of those receiving grants complain about all the red tape.
We got paperwork about this thick, so you have to fill out the paperwork, turn it in, and then you have to wait for your number to come up. It could be weeks.
While there's some frustration here with the federal response, the people of Charleston learned that what they can count on is the generosity of others. Food, clothing, and supplies came from across the country by the truckload. And Ray Gerard says the earthquake victims can expect the same.
I think have faith, stick in there, and it'll all come right eventually.
Charlestonians have already sent one plane load of emergency supplies to San Francisco. They feel they know better than most what people by the bay are going through tonight. Mike Von Fremd, ABC News, Charleston.
Joining us live now from Charleston in South Carolina, Mayor Joseph O'Reilly. Mayor Riley, you've been through it. You've worked with FEMA as you look at San Francisco. What advice do you give that federal agency?
Well, I hope they'll move quicker than they did here at the beginning. We learned that when we were in extremis that there just wasn't the proactive element. What we needed was for FEMA to come in and not, as they said, do an assessment about how many generators you need. There really should be a proactive response of truckloads of generators and water. And frankly, what I feel that we need for the first phase of a major disaster is really almost a military type activity where you've got the troops and the supplies and the manpower. They come in rather than say, give us an assessment before we can respond. That's what we needed in Charleston, and that would have immeasurably speeded up our recovery process.
Mayor, can I assume and beg you for a brief answer that you very much want the federal government's involvement, though?
Well, we need the federal government's involvement. We needed it at the beginning, and we need it throughout. This was a 500-mile hurricane, and we had plenty of warning, and FEMA could have been in here a heck of a lot sooner.
Thank you, Mayor, very much for taking the time to join us this evening. A lot of people out here actually were also in Charleston. I say that a number of people in the media have been here. Joining us this evening is the Associate Director of FEMA, Mr. Dennis Kwiatkowski. Mr. Kwiatkowski, they say this doesn't look as bad as Charleston. Does it look easier to you or easier to organize?
Well, any disaster of this size is never easy to organize. We're, of course, dealing with what is very close to a catastrophic situation. The Hurricane Hugo is significantly different than the earthquake with regard to the amount of warning we had, and also with regard to the amount of emergency needs that we had in Hurricane Hugo that do not appear to be evident. And I guess I would have to say that California was far more prepared for an event of this kind through many of the preparedness programs that we have been conducting out there in the past.
Mr. Kwiatkowski, I apologize. We're going to make this brief because the Vice President is just standing by, but I thank you for your observations. We'll be back in just a moment.
The Richter scale is the system seismologists use to measure the magnitude of energy released during an earthquake. Each number on the scale represents an earthquake 10 times stronger than the next lower magnitude. In other words, Tuesday's 7.0 Temblor was less than 1/10 the strength of the 8.3 quake that struck the Bay Area in 1906. The Great Quake of '89, an ABC News special, will continue in a moment. ABC News live coverage of the Great Quake of '89 will continue in a moment.
Tomorrow, fly over the San Andreas Fault and find out why it's so dangerous. Then, survivors relive the terror. Many say the big one's yet to come. What it will feel like. Sam Donaldson is there. Watch Primetime Live tomorrow.
This is an Action News Brief.
Good evening, Al Tersey in the Channel 8 newsroom. And coming up after ABC's special report on the California earthquake, we'll continue our coverage. The focus tonight on the 880 bridge, where rescuers have reportedly found a survivor. We'll have a live report out of San Francisco. Action News reporter John Crane is there. Plus, we'll have live report from Bradley Airport here in Connecticut as local residents return from the Bay Area. And 8 hours and counting, that's how long the SWAT team's been out in a standoff. And Hartford will take you there live, too, at 11.
Hi, Jeff Fox in the Weather Center. What an awful day today. And tomorrow, can you believe this? I think it's going to be worse. I'll tell you more about it tonight at 11.
Live from San Francisco, ABC News coverage of the Great Quake of '89 continues. Once again, here's Peter Jennings.
In San Francisco, not far from Fisherman's Wharf, where 24 hours ago people led productive lives. And like in so many other occasions, they're simply sweeping away the remains of people's lives, cleaning up the damage, which the earthquake didn't do. Vice President Quayle was here this afternoon. He's now flown back to Washington. He joins us briefly at Andrews Air Force Base. Mr. Vice President, thank you for giving us the time. As you wandered around here today, I'd like to know what your personal feelings were and what people told you who you encountered.
Well, my personal feelings were first one of great sadness. Sadness for the families of the victims, sadness for what had happened and occurred. The people that I talked to were somewhat upbeat. The brighter side of it was the tremendous response from the community. The volunteers have just been exceptional. Once again, the American spirit is rising to the occasion. But overall, my feeling inside was one of great sadness, and particularly for the families of the victims, and we still don't know how many there are.
Vice President, we agree with you, found the same sense of volunteerism here, which you referred to and which President Bush referred to earlier today. Some people here are a little suspicious of the White House's emphasis on volunteerism. It suggests there may not be federal money to help get the cleanup done.
There will be federal money, Peter, I can assure you that. The federal support will be full. It will be complete. But let us not underestimate this spirit of volunteerism. I met Marion of the Red Cross, who is a woman who left her job at the Red Cross when the earthquake occurred, went to that marina school, has not even been home when I left this afternoon to see whether her home has been damaged. She's been there helping people. Those are the types of people that really make this country great, and they are out there working right now in San Francisco.
I didn't mean for a second, Mr. Vice President, to underestimate volunteerism. Quite the contrary, agreed with you. But to fix the bridges here and to fix the highways and to build the buildings back again may require an enormous infusion of federal cash. What guarantee do folks here have that it'll be there?
They have a guarantee that the federal government and President Bush will do all that he possibly can. The President has already, as you well know, and I know that's been reported, made the declaration of a disaster. That means that the disaster assistance centers will be open, will be ongoing, will be beginning to process applications from people. We will assess the damage, and believe me, the federal government will be a partner in helping rebuild this unfortunate situation that we have.
Did you, on your way home, sir, speak to the President?
Yes, I did. I called him from Air Force 2 and talked to him for about 3 to 5 minutes and filled him in on what I found and what I see down the road.
And is he going to come out here on Friday?
I believe that the President will be coming out by the end of the week. I don't have a definite announcement to make.
Okay. Anything else that you saw here, sir, that particularly you take home with you, either in your head or in your heart?
Yes, I do, and I think that this needs to be said. One of the lessons that we can learn from this disaster is the value of preparation. I can guarantee you that after talking to the many people that I talked to, that if there had not been good preparation, such as good building codes, such as training for earthquakes, just 6 weeks ago they had Response 89, which my wife participated in, where you had federal, state, and local officials going down and going through a drill like this. Preparation pays off. Otherwise, this disaster that we have today would have been far, far greater.
On that subject, sir, you've probably heard all the criticism of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. You're going to hold that agency's feet to the fire? They didn't seem too prepared in Charleston.
Well, they are prepared. I met with the regional director today. They are on top of the situation, and I feel that we are in control of it.
Mr. Vice President, thank you for taking the time. I know it meant a lot to people when you wandered around here today and extended your sympathies. And as you point out, the President will probably come out at the end of the week. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
As Faye Vincent, the baseball commissioner, and Al Michaels and I noted a little earlier in the program, we didn't hear a lot of talk about the World Series out here today until it was announced that the series was going to be postponed at least until next Tuesday. Among a lot of San Franciscans and folks over in Oakland, it seemed almost in bad taste to talk about baseball when 300 of their fellow citizens had died and as many as 1,400 had been injured. That is not to say that people are not interested in the series by any means. Once again, here's our news and sports reporter, Al Michael.
This was the spectacular San Francisco scene with which we at ABC Sports came on the air last night. There was a festive atmosphere in Candlestick Park as the Giants and the A's prepared to start Game 3 of the 1989 World Series. Game time was still about 25 minutes away, and the players were in a basically relaxed mode. In our pregame show at roughly 4 minutes past 5, I felt the movement. There was no question in my mind what was transpiring. As part of our pregame show, Joe Morgan was on the field preparing to interview Willie Mays. Our cameras began to shake. We lost power momentarily before it returned. Then this PA announcement was read to the fans.
Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. In the case of an emergency, fans that are seated in the upper deck are asked to proceed to the nearest available exit.
No one was certain as to the extent of the structural damage, but it appeared to be relatively minor, all things considered. The fans eventually moved toward the exits in orderly fashion, and the vast majority of people at that point were unaware of the devastation throughout the Bay Area. Medical attention was needed by a few spectators, and then the wives and children of the players there, Terry Steinbach and his wife, Mark McGuire and his wife, Rick Russell of the Giants and his family, joined each other on the field. Commissioner Faye Vincent then had it announced to the crowd that Game 3 of the World Series would be postponed indefinitely. And ABC Sports' Gary Thorne at that point talked with San Francisco Police Commander Isaiah Nelson.
Being in San Francisco, we have a regular contingency plan that has gone into effect for the city. We have a command post set up citywide. We have a command post set up here in the stadium, and everything is being run at this time just very smoothly. Everyone has responded very well, very calmly. The evacuation is going very well.
Well, as the crowd exited Candlestick Park and began to head home, of course, nobody had any idea as to the magnitude of the destruction. But then once anybody from this area saw this particular shot, the enormity of what had taken place really hit home. This was a scene that could only have been envisioned in a movie, the collapse of a section of the Bay Bridge. The Bay Bridge, of course, is the major artery linking Oakland and San Francisco, the city of San Francisco with the entire East Bay region. In addition to what had taken place on the bridge, there was a major fire in the Marina District of the city of San Francisco, not far from the Golden Gate Bridge, apparently ignited by a broken gas main. That plume of smoke punctuated an otherwise typically gorgeous San Francisco sunset and was another scene that brought home the reality of this tragedy on a day that had been full of civic pride, a day that had begun with the enthusiastic anticipation of the third game of the World Series and ended spookily with an empty and eerie Candlestick Park. This afternoon, Peter, the inspection process began here at Candlestick Park and across the bay at the Oakland Coliseum as well. The Commissioner of Baseball, Faye Vincent, convened all of the interested parties, and at 5 o'clock in San Francisco this afternoon, he made the announcement, which you heard earlier in our broadcast tonight, that while it was not etched in stone, if things proceeded with relative normalcy, the third game of the World Series will be played here at Candlestick Park between the A's and the Giants next Tuesday night at 5 o'clock San Francisco time.
Al, you mentioned civic pride in your piece that has been disrupted. Didn't you find as you wandered around today not to make too much of it, that it's really there in this disaster?
Peter, I lived in this area for a long time. I must tell you, in regard to the commissioner's decision, I think it was a brilliant one. He is allowing the appropriate amount of time for the city to get back to some semblance of normality. I also think that by next Tuesday, this city might need a little boost or a little emphasis on real life returning and
a normal existence beginning to return. So I think Vincent was incredibly in tune with what was taking place. The fact, obviously, that he needs the structural integrity of the stadium so that people can actually come into the ballparks. He needs not to interfere, of course, with the process of making sure that all of the emergency services and other services are taken care of. And I think he's very much in tune with the psyche of this region at the moment.
Al, thanks very much for joining us. I hope you won't mind me saying that I watched you last night from New York City, and your reporting was stupendous. I don't know why some people think that sports reporters aren't news reporters, but you proved that there's no line between them. You reminded me of the great Jim McKay during the Munich Olympics in 1972. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
Peter.
Peter.
With some final observations about San Francisco and technology and how we're all joined together in just a moment.
During a magnitude 7 earthquake like yesterday's disaster, the Earth can jump as much as 6 to 7 feet along the San Andreas Fault in a single massive jolt. The Great Quake of '89, an ABC News special, will continue in a moment.
We're getting close to the end of our hour. It wouldn't be complete if we didn't look beyond the San Francisco and the Bay Area. The epicenter of this earthquake, as we pointed out at the beginning of the broadcast, was Santa Cruz, over there at the edge of the Santa Cruz Mountains, right on the Pacific Ocean. At the tip of the Silicon Valley tonight in San Jose, ABC's John McKenzie is standing by. John, they've had their own travails down there, haven't they?
They have, Peter. In terms of fatalities and injuries, they escaped pretty well. I mean, we have 6 confirmed dead in Santa Cruz, which is 40 miles south of us in San Jose. Several dozen injured in Los Gatos. Very few injured here in San Jose. In terms of actual damage, though, Santa Cruz, an estimated $350 million worth of damage. A 5-block shopping mall destroyed. In Los Gatos, homes, dozens of homes destroyed. Old Victorian mansions that escaped the Great Quake of 1906 that were destroyed last night.
What's the morale of people down there, John?
Pretty good. Remarkably good when you think about it. There's a great sympathy, a great outpouring of cooperation. In Los Gatos, for example, today, they set up a command headquarters, and there was an information desk where people were providing information to those homeless on where they could go for shelter, on where they could look for water. There's a shortage of water in the area. There was another table that was set up where architects and structural engineers assembled and were volunteering their services to go out and assess the damage of individual homes and suggest specific repairs that could be done. But in many cases, at least in Los Gatos, dozens of homes destroyed, there's not much they can do. People could just take the possessions they have and leave and allow the demolition crews to move in.
John McKenzie, thanks very much indeed from San Jose. Vice President Quayle really hit it on the head, I think, when he talked about the spirit of volunteerism out here, and now John McKenzie down there in San Jose confirms it. One of the comparison between now and 1906, or between any earthquake and the great earthquake of 1906, it was fire that really did all the damage in 1906, not the earthquake. And as has been repeated a number of times here today, we now live in an age where in this state, and it's one of the few places on Earth where they really prepare, those people who were most afraid were often those people in the high-rise buildings. They were the ones who were actually safest when those buildings swayed, because it meant they weren't going to snap or they weren't going to buckle. Well, now here's something good that man did today. The Space Shuttle Atlantis lifted off 1 day late on schedule, and a few hours after it got into orbit, they opened the cargo bay doors and they launched the Galileo space probe. One of the most adventurous moments, or the beginning of one of the most adventurous journeys that man is going to take into deep outer space, as the Galileo probe takes off on a 6-month journey to Jupiter, where it will separate into an orbiter and a probe. The orbiter, you can see them lifting it off now, the orbiter will go around Jupiter and the probe will go down into Jupiter's most unfriendly atmosphere, producing what scientists hope will be a wealth of information about our own solar system, because the Jovian solar system is in many ways a reflection of that here on Earth. And if this mission is as successful as people anticipate it's going to be, then there is a wealth of knowledge 6 years down the road for man as a result of the Galileo probe. 400 years after Galileo, the Italian astronomer, looked up and saw Jupiter with his 10-power telescope, and first identified the quartet of moons towards which this probe now heads. Finally, this evening from here in San Francisco, how near and yet how far? When the space shuttle lifted off today, we were reminded for a moment of the Challenger disaster. We always are whenever there's a liftoff of the space shuttle. And we were particularly reminded today of how, when the Challenger blew up, all of us all across the country were united by television. The disaster almost unfolded in front of us. Do you remember how we hung in front of our television sets, in some cases on television, for information to eke out from the Cape? Well, in many respects, it was the same thing last night, as ABC's Beth Nissen recalls.
Allowing Jose Canseco to score, and he fails to get Dave Parker at second base, so the Oakland A's take
It has been jarring to all of us to see last night the angel's eye view of the destruction, to realize that we are all connected by threads much more fragile than we think.
I would say that we've got a borderline regional catastrophe here.
All last night, there were audible aftershocks and visible fault lines in the normal. The television picture, the picture that is always, always there, fell from the screen, broke into static. When it came back, it could only bring us the news in fractions, in numbers.
We computed the magnitude at 6.9 on the Richter scale.
As 8 to 40 dead. 85,000 customers are without power just in the central
Without working dial tones or the hum of the fax machines, news came through the way it used to, carried from person to person.
We received a call from a man who said he spoke to his wife in Santa Cruz. Now that is the area...
Millions of Americans watched that one fire last night until they finally went to bed, thinking about everyone they ever knew who lived on the jagged western edge of the country. The Earth, despite the upheaval from its core, managed to make a quiet revolution into a new day. And already in this new day, there have been damage assessments, the movement of stolid bureaucracies and shaken people toward recovery. We interrupt this programming bulletins, tell us that everything is under control. It is good to hear, but we also hear, at the epicenter of ourselves, reminders of how little control we ever have.
ABC's Beth Nissen pointing out how united we all are in disasters like this, how united we all can be. Just before we leave, some bits and pieces of information. Al Michaels was mentioning the Oakland Bay Bridge. Everybody's mentioned the Oakland Bay Bridge, but he pointed out that last night 60,000 people got trapped on the San Francisco side because that access is so important to this particular neighborhood. Earlier today, officials said they believed that they would get that bridge working again in 3 weeks, giving rise to a great wave of skepticism here. But they say 3 weeks. Whatever the case, it's going to be historic gridlock, as someone put it earlier today, because the access from the Oakland side to the San Francisco side and vice versa is not very good at all. We started the program with some good news and we end with some bad news. We said that they'd found someone alive over on the interstate highway, the Nimitz freeway that they've been working on. They've used some infrared devices over there subsequently and have found that the person they thought was alive turned out not to be. And a couple of program reminders. Nightline obviously will be here to talk about this continuing story later this evening, and there'll also be a special edition of Primetime Live involving San Francisco. World News Tonight will be here again tomorrow. Hope you'll stay with us. We'll keep you up to date as best we can with the events of the Quake of '89. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us this evening. Good night from San Francisco.